Hello, good
There you
morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you're joining us from. My name is Joga Guburu. I'm with Wipro, and then I have with me Dr. Adam George. We both are going to um, help us think through how to date FDA and charm them in 6 meeting types or less. There is a recording of today's webinar. In case you want to refresh at a later time, you can access it or share with your colleagues. You could do that. And as for the questions, these regulatory briefs are supposed to be interactive. So please pose your questions such that the panelists can discuss those questions, and we think that is the best way for you to get most benefit. And if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to Holly. The email address is shown here. And at the end, please take a minute or so to provide us with feedback. This would help us to improve these educational activities in the future, as well as to give us ideas about other topics that might be of interest to you. Now, before we get into the topic, today's topic, let's briefly get to know Dr. Adam George. So, Dr. George, could you briefly share your professional journey with us?
Sure, happy to, Joe. Yeah, so I've been doing clinical and regulatory drug development for nearly 20 years now. Currently, I am operating my own consulting business, AMG Regulatory Consulting. But prior to that, I've had various different positions in clinical development and regulatory affairs in small pharma and large pharma, as well as time at FDA. As it relates to our specific discussion today, I was a clinical reviewer in the division of hematology products, which is one of the CEDAR review divisions. So I would have been the clinical discipline at FDA speaking during formal meetings such as type A, B, C meetings. We didn't have D meetings when I was there at that point in time. So, a little bit, that's basically me in a nutshell.
Thank you. So, when you were at the FDA, was this Project Optimus, popping up, or this was after you left the agency?
Yeah, so as a formal project, Project Optimus was after me. But I remind all my clients and everybody who talks about Project Optimus that justification has been a part of marketing applications and IND applications at FDA for years. It's just that the agency wanted to focus greater attention on dose justification, specifically on for oncology products, and also discuss and highlight more implementations on specifically the clinical pharmacology side with regard to exposure response modeling and other types of modeling that can be used for dose justification throughout your clinical development program as it leads up to your marketing application.
All right. So, um, may I request you, Dr. George, to kind of give a background on the different types of meetings that
Sure.
are alluded to in the Purdue 7, and then um, and perhaps we can pepper you with some questions as you go through the different types of meetings. And I would encourage one more time the audience to please pose your questions in the chat, and then we can use that for as a discussion point.
Sure, happy to, as long as it's salt. Pepper is not in my exact palate flavor. All right. So, what we wanted to do today was kind of talk to you about some of the basic meetings that are outlined and discussed in the formal meetings guidance for PDUFA products from the agency. As Joga had mentioned, we'll be focusing on some of the things that came out as a part of PDUFA 7, a couple new meetings there, but also we're going to discuss some of the traditional meetings that have been there for quite a while that we are all familiar with as the typical interactions to have with FDA. We're going to go in a bit of a letter order here. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Type A meetings. And the real purpose of these meetings are to discuss an otherwise stalled drug development program or safety issues. So you'll typically hear about sponsors having these types of meetings to discuss response to a clinical hold. That's often what we hear about, at least in the press side of things, because companies may announce that they've gone on clinical hold and they intend to have a Type A meeting with the agency to discuss a path forward on how to resolve the clinical hold. I've had many of these types of interactions throughout my time at FDA and throughout my time in industry. They are an effective tool as long as you use them as an effective tool. And we'll talk a little bit about some tips on how to use it as an effective tool. One of the other types of common uses for a Type A meeting is if the sponsor has received a recent complete response from marketing application. Here, again, under the guise of a stalled development, the whole purpose of that is to discuss a path forward on how to resolve the clinical response issue, the complete response issues that the agency has outlined in the complete response letter. One of the things that it's important to highlight here is that these meetings are often attended by FDA division leadership and office leadership because they tend to be high profile, especially as it relates to meetings that are held in response to a complete response. And it is very common to have multidiscipline involvement at these meetings. I can often remember when we were still having face-to-face meetings at the agency that the meeting room would be filled with a whole bunch of FDA personnel as well as sponsor team members as well. So tends to be quite a packed meeting. And so it's something to keep in mind as you're a sponsor and you're attending these meetings, just kind of a little bit of the, I guess, shock and awe if it's your first time attending of just how many people can be at these meetings. So just kind of, if you've never experienced it before, just be prepared that there's going to be a lot of people at the meeting. One of the other things that, especially as I work with different clients that may not be ultimately understood by everyone across the board, is that for a Type A meeting, the briefing document is due at the time of the meeting request. So what that means is you have to have your strategy planned out. You have to have how you want to communicate your strategy planned out, and you have to have your briefing document written, done, dusted, ready for electronic submission at the time you're submitting that meeting request. So that's one of the things that's a little unique to a Type A meeting. So let's talk about some tips for Type A meetings. So to me, one of the biggest things, because since we talked about what the basis for the meeting is, the goal is to gain clear agreement and advice from the agency on the path forward to address the issues, whether it be to address the clinical hold or to address the issues identified in the complete response letter. And in order to do that, one of the things, especially putting on my former reviewer hat, is that it is absolutely critical that the briefing document clearly communicates the strategy that you are trying to put forth through the agency to address their concerns. I can't tell you that there have been multiple times when I was a reviewer that I would read a document and it was not exactly clear on what it is the sponsor wanted to get across, what they were really trying to do. And so how that impacts the meeting is that some of the time is spent at the meeting discussing and getting clarity from the FDA side on what it is the sponsor is trying to really do here. And that, in my mind, is not taking maximal advantage of the time of the meeting. Really, the time that needs to be spent with the agency at this meeting is to get advice on the path forward and get clarity on if your strategic proposal is acceptable for them in order to move forward with executing on that strategy. One of the other things that helps with the briefing document being clear and communicating your strategy is it should be well written and succinct. This is not the time for a 300-page briefing document to discuss every single aspect of the development program. This needs to be very focused and targeted. And one of the things that you need to keep in mind with this is that the agency only has 30 days to review the briefing document. That's because the meeting is scheduled roughly 30 days after the meeting request goes in. Your briefing document goes in with the meeting request. So they've got 30 days to review your briefing document. So being clear and succinct are really important aspects to creating the briefing document. And another piece here is my recommendation is that your questions should be focused on gaining agreement on the proposed strategy to address the concerns of the agency. That also follows through and then on my recommendations for the actual meeting itself, right? Because there's the briefing document and then there's game day, which is having the interaction with the agency. So really, it's important to keep the meeting discussion focused on addressing the agency's concerns. I believe that if you've done a good job, the agency should be doing most of the talking. And that talking is communicating to you what they want, what they see, that either they have advice on your strategy or additional things they want you to consider within your strategy. Now, you will, as a sponsor, do a fair amount of talking because often the regulatory leads quarterback the meeting. But I guess my key thing here is now is not the time for theoretical, philosophical debates with the agency. It's really to be focused on a discussion to move things forward to address concerns. And another way to do that is come well prepared with the proposed plan to address the agency's issues. And the other thing I also often recommend is come prepared with backup plans as well. Because if the agency has a specific concern with your strategy, and maybe that strategy is a no-go in their mind, you should come prepared to discuss at least the proposal for an alternative plan. The agency may not be able to fully discuss that plan with you because that plan may not have been in the briefing document, and that's okay. But at least what you could get agreement on is the high-level proposal for the plan something that can be discussed with the agency as a follow-up to the type A meeting. So another tactic there. For these type of meetings, this is going to be one of the scenarios where you'll see where I actually think an in-person face-to-face, or they call them hybrids now, or virtual in face-to-face meeting is recommended. I do think there is value in a face-to-face interaction, whether it be virtual or in person for this type of meeting. So
if I can,
sure.
if we can have a little bit of a dialogue about type A meetings.
Sure.
And I'm also welcoming one more time the audience to kind of pose their questions or discussion points. So one of the motivations for a type A meeting, Dr. George, you said is a CRL, right? How much time does a sponsor have before they can submit a type A meeting request? And you're also alluding to the fact that the briefing book has to go with the meeting request in this case, correct?
Yep. Yep.
So how much time does the sponsor have to request type A meeting after receiving a CRL?
Yeah. They have, if I remember correctly, I believe it's 90 days to request the type A meeting after a complete response. I am just double checking the guidance. There is a specific period of time in which you have to request the meeting after receiving the action. So the moral of the story, to address, I guess, the bigger arching piece of your question, Joga, is time is finite in that type of scenario once you've gotten your CRL. So you have to be well organized from an organization standpoint with regard to interacting with your team members on the strategies for how you're going to address the concerns and what it is you want to talk to the agency about during that type of meeting.
Yeah. So the kind of a undercurrent in my question is the following: is it fair to say that the impending CRL might be, something typically a sponsor would expect by a post mid-cycle?
I mean, yes, but I have seen cases where CRLs have been unexpected as well.
I see. I see. So the bottom line is that all hands on the deck, I guess, because when it happens, you just don't have enough time, much time. You will have to kind of react, uh, so to say, on your feet. Now, in terms of fine, you alluded very clearly what the sponsor should take into account, when preparing the briefing book. Now, internally, once that meeting request and briefing book are submitted, can you um, can you explain to the audience what actually goes on, in your opinion, from a sponsor's end in terms of preparing for this meeting?
Yep. So typically, what you'll do is you'll have prep meetings as a team. You will discuss about what are the specific aspects that you want to talk with at the agency, and then you will actually practice talking through that. I recommend clients to actually have kind of like a mock FDA meeting. um, get the team members that are going to be doing either the talking or responding to questions or making the proposals, have them practice in front of another group of individuals. Those individuals can act like FDA, and you can role play there and have some strategy types of almost like a playbook. I've had a couple cases where I've actually created playbooks when either I was at the client side or helping a client prepare, which is, okay, this is what we're gonna, this was our question to the agency about our proposal. We're going to discuss this with them. Let's play through the scenario where they agree, but they have some certain tweaks that they want to emphasize. Let's play through the scenario where they absolutely do not agree with our proposal. And how are we going to communicate that during the meeting? And then have the speakers for the meeting, and when I say the speakers, the sponsor speakers, practice through that. So that way, you're basically prepared for the actual meeting itself, and you try to be as prepared as you can. No surprises would be the ultimate goal for that type of meeting.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay, sure. All right. So the next type of meeting that we typically use in the industry are type B meetings. There are multiple flavors of these meetings with different timelines. As you can see here, you have your typical pre-IND, pre-BLA application meetings that are 60 days from the meeting request. And then you have your end of phase meetings, which are about 70 days from the meeting request. We're not going to go into the very intricacies, nitty gritties of an end of phase versus a pre-application. We're going to really speak more high level on things as it relates to just tips for the meeting and things like that. Key thing here, though, is a type B meeting, regardless of what it is really the point to discuss major development milestones, whether it be your first in human, end of phase 1, or end of phase 2. These type of meetings are often attended by division leadership. If it's the case of a pre-application meeting, you might get office leadership there for a new chemical entity type of application or a new biologic. So you might see the office leaders there, but definitely you're going to see division leadership and obviously your disciplines. Another case where you might see division leadership is products that have breakthrough therapy designation. This is another one of those meetings where you're going to have multiple disciplinary involvement. Let's take a pre-IND meeting, for example. You're going to have non-clinical, you're going to have CMC, you're going to have clinical there. Those are your typical players at those types of meetings. Now that obviously changes a little bit. Later on down the line, you'll have the clinical pharmacology team helping you out, especially if there are certain specific aspects that you want to discuss with them. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. So one of the things about a type B meeting is you only get one of each type. So for instance, you only get one pre-applicant, you only get one pre-IND meeting, you only get one to end of phase 2 meeting. So you got to make it count. And so here, the briefing document needs to strike a fine balance because it is a major milestone meeting in a development program. So there is a bit of groundwork that needs to be laid on what has been done with the development program, what types of studies have been done, what data points have been a byproduct of those studies, things like that. So it does need to be a fairly comprehensive presentation of data, but my recommendation here is that presentation needs to be adequate to inform the discussion without it being an actual novel. The briefing document should not be a novel. So what that means is you really want to be focused and scrutinize the type of data that you really want to put in here. And I would say you want to put in the data that is the most salient to the topics that you're going to discuss at the meeting. There are often questions to multiple disciplines at these type of meetings. So when you outline your questions, you need to arrange them by your discipline, whether or not it's clinical pharmacology or clinical. That helps the review teams understand who is the audience and who is to be addressing those comments. And there are times where there are questions that are going to span multiple disciplines. There are often times where there's going to be a question that spans the clinical discipline as well as the statistical discipline. That's fine to identify it as such, clinical and stats. But that helps the agency to understand which reviewers the client and the sponsor is seeking input from. And in this case scenario, I often say that type B meetings should be a collaborative two-way discussion. It's important for you to understand the FDA's position, but you also want to ensure that the FDA understands your position on things. If they're not clear, take the time to discuss and be clear and try to make them understand where you're coming from on things. The other thing is that now's your opportunity to get clarity on any confusing aspects of the preliminary meeting comments that they send you. The agency sends preliminary meeting comments before the actual meeting itself if you have, let's say, a TCON or a video conference. If it's written response only, well, then the written responses are the only type of feedback you're going to get from them. But if it's the case of an actual meeting, then get clarity on any confusion you may have with the preliminary comments. And, ask FDA to explain their position if their position in your mind breaks with the precedent of prior approvals. Um, they may have a very well thought out reason as to why your development program they're taking a different position on. And if that's the case, you want to understand why that is. So that way you are clearer and understanding their thinking and potentially can have a creative way to address their issue. And maybe you can get some type of agreement on a path forward that could get your program more consistent with the precedent. Here, video conference is an effective tool. Um, you might want to consider an in-person meeting for a pre-application meeting, simply so that way maybe the FDA puts a face to the sponsor team members that they'll be interacting with throughout the application. But in general, I like to recommend video conferences or teleconferences for type B meetings. And one of the reasons why I like video conferences and teleconferences so much is that it has one of my favorite strategy tools is the mute button, where you can ask the agency to go on mute, and then you can have a conversation with your team, and then come back off of mute and have a discussion with the agency based upon something that you just discussed with your team members. So, Doug, I actually wanted to ask you a question. I understand that you have experience with model-informed drug development, and have you had any experience with any type of type B interaction, whether it be an end of phase 2, and discussing with the agency a strategy for model-informed drug development?
Yeah. And so I've had quite a bit of experience with these. I want to say a bit more scientifically intense meetings, such as MIDD, and then there's another one called Complex Innovative Trial Design Meeting, CID, with the stats. The fundamental difference, I think they fall under type C, by the way, but the fundamental difference between the ABC versus these two other meetings, MIDD and CID, are that these are the ABC meetings are kind of, I want to say, to a large extent, routine. The type of questions and so on are pretty standard. There are unique questions per program, but still, in the bigger scheme of things, it's more of a opinion, yes, no, maybe so type of questions. MIDD and CID are more open-ended, meaning discussions where there is quite a bit of technical review that has to occur before rendering an opinion or coming up with a consensus between the sponsor and the agency. Hence, they come in paired meetings. So you would meet with the agency today, and then if there are issues that are still unresolved, you get a second chance in 60 days to meet with the agency again to pursue that, the meeting topics.
Right.
Are there any other? I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. And thank you for, I probably didn't ask the question as clear as I should have. Yes, you can have those specific discussions as part of a type B. I was mainly getting at the point that you can have you can discuss a complex, innovative trial design with the agency at a type B, particularly an end of phase 2 meeting. if your phase 3 trial involves a complex and innovative design. So that's where I was going with that. But anyways,
But you raised an important point, though,
yeah,
meaning the sponsor has to make a decision which path,
yep,
the yellow brick road or the red brick road they need to, embark on. And my advice in these matters has always been that the meeting which will ensure the right audience for you is the most important. And um, and then especially if it is a very loaded in terms of statistical or other analysis, clinical pharmacology analysis,
yep,
you would want to make sure that the right offices are included, and these pathways might be something the sponsors can consider as a first um preference, and then have a fallback with one of the other alphabets.
yep,
So we
yep.
have a few questions, Dr. George.
Sure.
Um, the questions are the FDA meetings recorded?
They are not, and they're not supposed to be recorded.
Yeah. Who is responsible for taking meeting minutes, and are the meeting minutes shared between FDA and sponsor?
Yeah, great question. So, from the agency side, the FDA project manager takes minutes of the discussions that occur during the meeting. Okay, those those meeting minutes will be incorporated along with the preliminary meeting comments that you got, um, and that will be sent as formal minutes from the agency side on the meeting. Now, on the sponsor side, I often recommend that the sponsor picks one or two different team members to take minutes, while the other team members can take notes, right? Just jot down certain things that they remember from the discussion, because everybody hears things differently, right? And so it's good to have multiple people's kind of like account of what happened. But as far as for formal minutes, like being more prescriptive on the specifics of what to discuss, what was done when, exactly who was doing the discussion, one or two members from the sponsor side. Now, those minutes do not have to be submitted to the IND, let's say. Some sponsors choose to submit their minutes to the IND, but that is the sponsor's choice. There is no requirement from that. And on the FDA side, it's hit or miss whether or not the reviewers will actually take a look at those minutes. So,
Okay. And then, so the only official minutes are the ones that the FDA gives you.
correct. Those are the official minutes.
Yeah.
That's the one that counts for the record.
Yeah. All right. So there's another question, which is, if the sponsor is from EU
Yep.
and has business with the US FDA,
Yep.
should there be a US agent coming along with the sponsor, let's say for a pre-IND meeting?
Yes. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they have to do the bulk of it. They have to do all of the talking. But yes, the U.S. agent should, a representative of the U.S. agent should be at the meeting. They are the official one who is corresponding with the meeting, with the agency, as far as for the official correspondence back and forth written. But other team members from the sponsor can absolutely do the majority of the talking at that type of meeting.
I see. Is that is it a recommendation, or that's kind of requirement?
My understanding, in this different divisions do different things. So, but my understanding is that it is a requirement. But I would say check with your project manager at your review division on what they require for the procedures for their division.
All right. Um, there is another question, but it involves a different meeting type you haven't touched yet. So I'll wait for you to proceed and then bring that question back.
Okay, will do. So I notice we have about 25 minutes left, so I'm going to go a little bit faster through the next meeting type, which is type C. So basically, this is what I like to call your catch-all type of meeting, when other meetings just don't fit. It's often intended by the reviewers and some members of division leadership. Infrequently, you'll see office leadership. They can be there, but it's not a high priority for them, a type C meeting. Type C meetings can be limited to one discipline. You could ask just the clinical team questions, nobody else, or you can involve multiple disciplines. Type C meetings can be just one question. If you only have one thing you want to ask with the agency and you want formal written feedback for them, type C meetings the way to go. They're often granted as written response only, but video conferences and TCONs are options as well. I will say some tip that I can give is that if you're requesting a video conference or a teleconference, make a strong rationale for why you want to have that type of an interaction with the agency. So tips, like everything, well-written documents helps, but in this case in particular, I believe a well-written meeting request for any meeting is helpful, but particularly a type C meeting, because it helps the reviewers understand what it is the sponsor is trying to get at, what they want to discuss at this meeting, what are the questions, and what is kind of the context of the drug in the development. Okay, because that's not necessarily as clear. A type C meeting can be held at any point during the development program. So one of the things that's important in the meeting request is make it clear where you're at in your development stage, because that gives the reviewers context for some of the questions for the meeting. Another tip that I've had good success with is submission of the briefing document earlier than what is required increases your chances of getting your preliminary meeting comments earlier. So like I had mentioned before, the agency often gives you, if it's the case of a TCON or a video conference, they'll give you preliminary meeting comments. I've had good success where if I've gotten the briefing document in, 5 days early, a week early, if possible, I've gotten my preliminary written feedback earlier than what is anticipated per the PDUFA 7 goals commitments letter. One of the things that I often found as a reviewer, sponsors inadequately describe where their product is currently at in the development program in their type C briefing document, which leads to confusion for me. Are you talking about this endpoint to use an exploratory phase 2 study, or are you talking about using it as a primary endpoint for a phase 3 study to support approval? Those things, that context is important. And I also recommend including high-level future plans for the development program as appropriate. Sometimes this provides context. Like for instance, if you're saying we intend to use this endpoint now as a secondary endpoint in our exploratory phase 2 study, but we want to bring it forth for the potential to use it as a primary endpoint in the phase 3 studies. That helps me as a reviewer to give feedback if you ask me questions about the meeting. So the next type of meeting that has been introduced with PDUFA 7 is the type D meetings. This is a more focused meeting. Specifically, FDA outlines in the guidance that this is the type of meeting you want to select if you have one or two key issues critical to advance the development program. You can follow up on other aspects of the topics discussed at a type D meeting in a type C meeting as possible. Or if it's a pre-application, you've held a pre-application meeting already, and there's further things that came up in that meeting that you want to discuss, like one or two further clarification points you want to discuss, maybe a type D meeting is appropriate for that. These type of meetings are typically attended by the specific disciplines to which questions are addressed. So if you don't ask a non-clinical question, don't expect the non-clinical toxicology reviewers to be there. My recommendation, video conference or a teleconference for this type of meeting. Again, because my favorite strategy tool is the mute button. And one of the other things to highlight here for this type of meeting is the briefing document is due at the time of the meeting request. Some tips here. Focus your time and effort on making the meeting request crystal clear. It reduces the chances of the meeting getting reclassified as a type C. So a little bit of a tip there, because the agency can always reclassify a meeting. Just because you ask for a type D doesn't mean they have to grant it as a type D. They could grant it as a type C. So make your meeting request be effective, clear, and justify why you feel a type D meeting is appropriate. Again, briefing document should be succinct and focused on the two key issues. Now is not the time to talk about other types of issues. This is really focused on the key issues that you have questions about in the meeting. So it's not the time for comprehensive discussions or lengthy explanations. Jug, I see a question here on the type D meeting.
Yes, I was hoping you might want to touch on the interact as well, but
Yes.
we can.
That's my next meeting I wanted to talk about, interact. We can move to interact if you want, or if you wanted to.
Yeah, if we can just finish that, we can then have these questions,
Okay.
because I'm sure there'll be like follow-up questions on this.
Okay. Very good. All right. Interact, another new meeting that brought up as part of PDUFA 7. Okay. So this is appropriate for novel products and development programs with unique challenges prior to a pre-IND meeting. So this is almost, I don't really want to call it a pre-IND meeting, but it is a meeting because a pre-IND meeting has very specific things that you need to discuss. But really, this is the point for if you have questions to the agency about, let's say, the design of a non-clinical GLP toxicology study to support an IND, this could be an appropriate type of meeting. Now, one of the things the agency points out in the guidance is that it is to discuss novel issues for novel products. So if there is a well laid out plan of attack for, let's say, how to do a GLP tox study for this specific concern that you are wanting to discuss with the agency, an interact meeting may not be appropriate. But if there's something novel that you need to integrate into the GLP tox study for your particular product, or if you're developing a platform of products, that may be very well appropriate for an interact meeting. Now, one of the other things to point out with an interact is that these are actually new to the CEDAR team, but CBER has been using interact meetings for a number of years now. So on the CDER side of the ball, it's a relatively new meeting, so just less experience with it on the CEDAR side. Not that that means anything in particular, other than just, for instance, there's not as many people who may have experience with this. I will tell you, for example, I have never done an interact meeting. I do most of my work with CEDAR. I have yet to do an interact meeting. So. Briefing document due at the time of meeting request. This is important because you don't have additional time after the meeting request goes in to finish a briefing document. So you have to have all your data necessary to make the arguments and inform the discussion ready at the time when you're requesting the meeting. And so you better make sure that you have adequate internal time for document creation and availability of data to support the discussion. That's in my opinion, that's pretty critical, especially when you're in the early drug development, non-clinical side of the ball. It can be variable when data is coming in sometimes. So you really need to be cognizant about when that data is really going to be coming in, because your briefing document is due at the time of the meeting request. So like the other meetings, focus time and effort on making the meeting crystal clear. And also, I will say, as the sponsor, you should be critical of the meeting purpose and the questions. Are the questions you are asking or the topic you want to discuss with the agency, is it truly unique and or novel? If it is not, then this may not be the right meeting for you. So, Joga, that is all I had on.
Yes, thank you. So we have a bunch of questions we need to address. The first one is um, for an IND of a biologic product, and the first time in human clinical trial is already um, either taking place or completed in Europe. The question is, what type of meeting is recommended for the FDA?
Okay. Yeah, so if you don't have an active on, if you haven't done a study yet in the United States, so you don't have an active IND from that standpoint, a pre-IND meeting is absolutely appropriate. It's actually quite common. One of the common places where you'll see that a lot is 505(b)(2) type of drugs, where their initial studies are done ex-US and they come over and their initial interactions of pre-IND interaction, but yet the focus of the meeting is more like phase 2 type of discussions or phase 3 type of discussions. And that can even be in the case if maybe they haven't done any sort of ex-US clinical development. If it's a 505(b)(2), because they're allowed to leverage some experience with the active moiety prior, they can start off right at phase 2 or maybe head off right into the registrational trial to support the marketing application. So pre-IND meeting for that specific case though.
So a question like kind of follow up to one of the previous ones was is that for non-US companies, is a US agent required for drug products? The person acknowledges that this is a requirement for devices. So the question is a US agent required for drug products?
Well, you need to, yeah, you have to have a US authorized agent if you are entirely ex-US company.
Okay. Are there any limits on the number of attendees from sponsor side to these meetings?
Officially, there's not a number that I am aware of, but it does need to be limited to the people who are going to be have speaking roles at the meeting. You can have one or two others that may potentially have a speaking role, right, for support staff that can also be taking notes, but generally you want to make it limited. If you have somebody who's taking meeting minutes and that is their entire role, that person can go. But what you can't have is a list of 20 people and then there's really only going to be 3 or 4 speakers and then everybody else is this, all the other 16 people are there to listen. That's not appropriate. So you have to be judicious. So but you can take a little bit of leeway, you know. If somebody might have a possibility of having to talk during the meeting because something may come up because of one of the alternative strategies that you might propose, yeah, they can come. But just be mindful of how many people are on that attendee list.
All right. Can type D meeting be used to determine whether an approach is appropriate for iStand or any other pilot programs?
That is a great question that I do not know the answer to. You know who you could ask? You could ask your project manager for your IND. That could be somebody who you could ask, but I do not have any experience with that, so I can't comment.
Yeah. Let me add my own views
Sure.
on that. So these other pilot programs, iStand or the drug development tools and such, they are a, a quotes is kind of a submission pathway by themselves. So the way to think about them is to submit your, um, you know, the your objective of the drug development tool, what you're seeking, to the contact that's available on the FDA website, and then there would be a initial process in terms of the background information and such, and the work that you would have conducted. So that is what would trigger FDA to guide you on how to communicate, how to meet, and so on. So I I don't think requesting a type D or any other type of meeting cold without having a discussion, in terms of a submission, a written submission about the intention for a DDT submission, probably is unwarranted in my opinion.
Okay.
So then what happens if we request a wrong meeting type? Are we going to be guided by the FDA about the correct alphabet?
Mostly yes. I mean, have been cases where I have seen that the incorrect meeting type has been requested and the agencies just flat out rejected it. But that's really rare. Usually, what'll happen is the project manager will either contact the sponsor and say, "We feel this is appropriate as a type C meeting," for example. Um, if we grant it that way, would the sponsor still be accepting of having the interaction? Or they may just reclassify it as part of the meeting request granted letter and maybe not email you like I had just said and ask you that. But yeah, you should, in general, the agency is pretty good about helping the sponsor out with that kind of thing. So. But one of the things I will say is if you are truly kind of on the fence about what to ask, you can always reach out to your FDA project manager, give them an idea of the type of meeting that you're thinking about, and let them know what you'd like to request and get their feedback on it. That's an option, or you could just submit it and see what happens. Like I said, the agency would in more often than not, they'll just reclassify it to the meeting type that they feel is appropriate.
All right. I think um, one last call for questions from the audience. But there is one question which is really not per se directly related to this topic, but in general, a regulatory question, which is, does CBER oversee all biological products?
No, no. CBER does specific types of biologic products. More of the cell and gene therapy, that's what they do. Your traditional monoclonal antibodies, that's CDER, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. CBER does your gene therapies, your vaccine products, that kind of thing.
Okay. Then, um, if a sponsor has not interacted with the FDA yet,
Yep.
and in your comments, Dr. George, you alluded to contacting the FDA project manager.
Yep.
Who do we know who to contact?
Okay, very good question. All right. So first of all, you want to know what therapeutic area in. Are we in derm and dental, or are we in oncology? All right, that's your first kind of way to determine. From there, once you understand what therapeutic area in, then you can search the FDA website to find out what division is responsible for that therapeutic, what office and/or division is responsible for that therapeutic area. A lot of times you'll have the therapeutic area being an office, and there will be a lot of different divisions that handle different pieces of that therapeutic area. For oncology, for example, oncology is handled by multiple different divisions. There's a couple different solid tumor divisions. There are two different heme malignancy divisions, and the indications they cover should be outlined on the FDA website. Okay. Now, if you so once you have an understanding of what the indication, let's say it's acute myeloid leukemia, and that is division of heme malignancies 1, you can the email address for the chief project manager for the division should be on the FDA division website. You can contact the chief project manager to talk to them first if you don't have an application already. It's actually common in the case where sponsors are doing, they're in the pre-IND stage. They administratively get their IND, and then they don't have a project manager assigned yet. So you'll talk to the chief project manager of that division responsible for the indication for which your drug is going to be developed in.
Yeah.
And if you get that wrong, no big deal. The chief project managers talk to each other. They'll connect you to the other division project manager. They're very helpful.
Yeah. But are these not the cases, Dr. George, that companies, sponsors typically engage, experts such as yourself?
It happens. Yeah. I mean, I serve clients from small pharma all the way up to big pharma, and, they engage me with questions as simple as who to reach out to, or to actually help them prepare for briefing documents, or help them prepare for the FDA meetings, that kind of thing. I often have a lot of cases where the client has their own regulatory team. I just come in as an ex-FDA kind of from a mindset to give them kind of an understanding what FDA might be thinking about their proposals.
Outstanding. So with that last comment, I would like to close this regulatory brief for this month. Before we punch out, I wanted to thank Dr. George for taking time to share his wisdom with all of you, and also thank you, audience, for the very useful questions. Two closing housekeeping notes. One, you probably saw a feedback link on your screen. Please take a minute to provide us feedback. It is very valuable for us. And we also are hosting a conference to discuss how to set drug development strategy and at the University of Maryland. And there is a link for that if you wanted to pursue and share with your friends. It provides a neutral ground for the regulators as well as folks from pharma to interact and discuss challenging topics and policies and such. So it's been run for a couple of years. So we're doing it for the third time. Please check the agenda out. You will be impressed with the line of speakers and committee members. Thank you very much. Have a good week. Take care. Thank you, Dr. George.
Thank you, Jared.